Okay, today I'm going to tackle this painting. It was a plein air sketch made up in Killarney. It was an odd day. It had a streaks of grayness in the clouds, which made it feel like it might be heading towards overcast. But at the same time, there was a lot of sun. There's a lot of brightness. The rocks were quite bright. The water was shimmering with reflections of the sky. The foliage stood out. And so it was really bright where I was painting, and it came out really dull. So I've often wanted to go back to this one and do it over. Make it brighter, make the sun glow, the rocks glow the way they did at the time. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do this time around, and hopefully I'll succeed. To me, the most important part of the painting are the rocks. The rock faces, the colors are more or less the right colors, the way I felt about it at the time. Each of these different rock slabs had a slight different tint. The Quinacridone Magenta to form a nice magenta, taking Indanthrene Blue to move it into a warmer version of the magenta. And we're going to start. Now, these rocks tended to be directional rocks. They moved from the upper part down to the lower part in great directional streaks. The thing about acrylics is that they have a tendency to dry down darker than they look like when they're going down. It's partly in the nature of how they dry. Acrylics dry through evaporation. They're suspended in a polymer medium, surrounded by lots of water. As the water evaporates out, the polymer collapses, flattens out. It's one of the reasons why brushstrokes tend to disappear in acrylic. They don't stand out like they do in oil. And that's because the polymer shrinks. And as it shrinks, all of those little pigment molecules get closer and closer together. And as they get closer and closer together, they get darker. As they get darker and flatter, what you painted changes. So you have to keep that in mind as you're painting, and make sure that you end up with what you wanted, what you saw. Now, unfortunately, there's no formula. It's not like, it dries 20% or 10% darker or 5%. Is they're going to dry at different rates darker. So you have to compensate for that as well. And that just comes with experience. Because each time you mix the paint, there's a different ratio between the various paints, and therefore each one of them, as it dries down slightly differently. So you're not going to get something that's always going to do exactly what you think. So acrylic is rather challenging that way. Now, you can see from the way I've been putting it, the light is obviously falling down this way, hitting these upper surfaces of these rocks, and then falling off into darkness. I've worked on my purpley areas, trying to make them stand out. sometimes you have to go and almost create something that looks garish, because as it dries down, it subdues. Don't be afraid to get a little bold with your colors. Now I'm going to put in the water shimmers, even though I normally would do the water last. I'm putting in the shimmer while I have the paint mixed. And the shimmer in the water, the reflection, should always be darker than the what it's reflecting. Now, these greens have really darkened. There was light hitting them, and within the greens there were streaks of reddy colors. It's I think what it was is the bushes were turning for autumn, and amongst the junipers there were these deciduous bits that were turning fall color. It was an subtle but an interesting little effect was going on there, but there was still sunlight hitting them. Now the next most important thing to get are the trees. And I'm going to start working on the trunks, which I'm going to use Indanthrene Blue and Burnt Umber to get a neutral black. And because I want higher contrast than was in the original painting, I'm going quite dark here. Now you see that I'm not painting along a big long streak. I'm painting a series of straight lines, because if you actually look carefully at branches, streams, all sorts of things, there really are a bunch of straight lines that have little kinks in them that create the what we see as the bends. There are some that are very sinewy and bendy, like weeping willows and things like that, but most branches and things are not. They are much more a series of straight lines. And the advantage of painting them in straight lines is you can paint them a lot faster, a lot more accurately, and they end up looking right. Okay, it seems to be going all right. And now the greens. These are coniferous, so instead of Indanthrene Blue, I'm going to use the Phthalo Blue and yellow, which will produces quite an artificial, wild-looking green. But then I take the Napthol Red, which dulls it down to a much less artificial-looking green, and I'm going to use that for the dark bits. Because they're so small, I don't want the dark bits to be too dark, because they'll just sort of disappear into the branches then. And then I lighten them up with both white and additional yellow to create the highlights. Okay, a little bit down here too. Maybe just some skimming over the edges of that without drawing it off the edge. This back forest, this is actually the mainland. This is an island. This is the mainland. It's quite a ways off, so it's you can't see the individual trees particularly, but it's gone a bit too gray. It needs to have a little bit of green in it. So I'm going to use the Quinacridone Magenta and the Phthalo Green to mix a sort of neutrally gray. And the darkest bits came up from the shoreline and went up into the rest of the grayness of that distant shore. Things as they go off into the distance tend to get cooler, lighter, and more simple. So I've gone away from that purpley look that had been there with previously. Now, the purpley look would work quite well if these were distant mountains, because that's really distant, and they tend to go quite into the blues and purples. Get quite cold as they get far away, but these you could still detect that they were trees and things, foliage, and so you could still see there was some greenishness to it, but it had sort of dulled down to a green-gray. So there's our green-gray. Well, that's all we can do for today. Look to the other clip to see how I finish this. If you have any comments, paste them below. Thanks. See you next time.